and a whole range of education-related research. He's an associate professor of physiology and pharmacology and course director for the undergraduate pharmaceutical science course at Kingston University. As a pedagogic researcher, he's run a range of national workshops, and part of the reason for inviting him here is that I've seen him speak on many occasions, and it's always extremely educational as well as enjoyable. He's a senior fellow of the HEA, a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, and until recently was the lead for the Royal Society and the Physiological Society. He was appointed in 2014-15 as the HEA Bioscience Teacher of the Year, and he now chairs that panel. He's also a National Teaching Fellow, which was awarded in 2021, and he's also done a lot of work and has been nominated for his outstanding contribution to equality, diversity, and inclusivity by the Times Higher Education Awards in 2022. So, Nick, I hope that's a reasonable introduction. We really look forward to hearing what you've got to say. And I'm going to at this point hand over to you. So we look forward to hear what you've got to say. Thank you.
Geez, the only way is downhill now after that glowing introduction. I hope I can live up to half of that. Oh my goodness. So we should say thank you to Julian. He's standing on the edge of Dartmoor at the minute, where it's about -3 degrees, and he's out in the wilds of Dartmoor. So thanks to Julian for taking the time to introduce me, even though he's shivering there in the cold. So yes, as Julian said, a lot of my practice has been involved with equality, diversity, and inclusivity, which is a really hot button topic in Britain, at least in a British higher education context. Given the very diverse nature of our society, that filters into universities, and many of our universities are very diverse institutions indeed. So I will share some slides with you. I'm hoping to share a video of the kind of data analysis we undertake at Kingston University, so we can address the learning needs of specific cohorts of students. Because unless we can identify our students and their specific learning needs, we're never going to be able to put forward interventions to help them. So I guess you can see my slideshow here. And I'd like to credit Dr. Neil Williams here for some of the analysis of the data I'm going to show. And Harry Chanjon-Peter was one of my project students who did some very, very nice work in one of the little schemes I undertake. So hopefully I'm going to tell you about the use of data to initiate targeted interventions to address awarding gaps. And awarding gaps is a really big thing in the British higher education context. Our students come, as I said, from very diverse backgrounds in most universities in the UK. So, for instance, in a typical class that I teach for pharmacology, I may have 100 students in there. There may be 1 or 2 white faces in that class. And those students who present as white, they're likely to be Polish or Lithuanian or Latvian. We hardly have any, in my cohorts at least, white British students. They're mainly immigrant populations, students who've come to Britain with their families, first generation into higher education, maybe English is their second, third, or even fourth language. So many of the interventions we've developed at Kingston involve looking at the student demographic and finding out if there are any specific learning needs for some of those unique identities the students present with. So here's a view of some of our student body. I recognize some of my students there. There's Matthias in the front. He was a Polish student, so he was present in my class, but largely my class looks a bit more diverse than this actually. But as you can see, this is my institution is a London university, and London is a destination for many immigrant populations. Thus, many of my students come from those diverse backgrounds, and that is not unusual in many British universities. So this is the kind of student body that we're facing. So obviously, I am a bold, middle-class white bloke, and what my life experiences are likely to be very different from those of my students. So I think it's incumbent upon me to try and relate to my students and find out their learning needs, to relate to them as individuals. Otherwise, I could be speaking and nobody's understanding anything I'm saying. That science as a foreign language is just filtering over their heads and not entering into their brains, and they're not learning. So we make a conscious effort at Kingston to understand our students so that what we're teaching them means something to them as individuals and is relevant and relatable. So our students look like this. They're a very diverse cohort of students. So here's what I'm going to try and, just for a second, run our database. So hopefully, colleagues, you can see what I'm seeing. So this says it's a CEP and course group hub for undergraduates. So I'm the course leader for a suite of undergraduate degrees called pharmaceutical science, as Julian said. And I have to write every year a course evaluation plan, a CEP, course evaluation plan. Hopefully you can see my cursor floating across the screen. Now into that course evaluation plan filters all of the modules. So every module leader has to write a module evaluation plan. And I, at the end of the year, look at all of those module evaluation plans and see how students have progressed in each module, and then write a course evaluation plan to cater for the students in the following years. We identify any problems and any specific learning needs. So the data we have is quite granular. So you can see on the middle of the page there, it says G49050, first degree pharmaceutical science. There's a drop down menu and I just click on the menu and my degree scheme comes up. Let's just play the video if we can. So in the middle where it says select your course group, in a minute it's going to say pharmaceutical science. So there's the pharmaceutical science database. So here are my students year on year, 2022-23, 36 in level 3. That's a foundation year in our system. So that's pre-university qualifications, which enables students from year 3 to go into year 4, which is the first year of our classical BSc science degree. So that's level 4, level 5, and level 6. In the British context, the classical year 1, year 2, and year 3 of a science degree. So we have this number of students rolling through the system every year. Thanks. We have this number of students rolling through the system every year, and I can use a pull-down menu just here, which other group is key for your course group, a pull-down menu, and highlight different demographics of our student body. So here's the ethnic makeup of my students, color-coded. The purple is white students, I think. No, probably not actually, but I can't see down there. Maybe you can see that. But the color coding tells us the ethnic makeup of the student body in my degree course. Every course leader can pull down the same data for their own students. Age on entry, so most of my students fall within the traditional age bracket of the British higher education student, 18 to 21. About a third of them are outside of those rough parameters. Now this database in the middle is one that really interests me, the IMD quintile. This is the so-called index of multiple deprivation. So this tells you how socially, the social background of your students. That index of multiple deprivation includes things like family circumstances, even air pollution in a local area, level of schooling. So lots of characteristics fit into that index of multiple deprivation. And it came as a bit of a surprise to me to find that at least a third of my students under those criteria were quite deprived. So that means that they're not in the highest social class. They come from quite modest and humble origins, and they live quite modestly and maybe even precariously. So without having seen this data, I would have just treated my students as a homogeneous whole. They're all London students. They all come into Kingston, and I treat them all as one discrete unit. This kind of data tells me that there are significant deficits in some of the life circumstances of my students. At least a third of them are in the second quintile of the IMD index of multiple deprivation criteria. So this means they may have significant disadvantages when it comes to learning. They may not have a room of their own to study in at home. They may not have a reliable internet connection at home. They may not have a computer at home. So if there's any online or blended learning, they're going to be at a disadvantage. So at the very least, I should bear that in mind when I'm lecturing to my students, that some of them come from very modest backgrounds and may not have the cultural or other resources that other students have. Another feature common to London universities is the fact that students travel large distances. So there's a little data set there about commuting versus non-commuting students. And you can see there that lots of my students commute. And lots of them commute across London, and that is quite a tricky journey for some of them. Traveling east to west across London is difficult, even with the opening of the new Elizabeth line. So they can travel up to 2 hours just to get to university and then 2 hours back. Some of my students do that journey every day, 4 hours of traveling to come to university. So we should bear in mind that students who've come to us for a 9 o'clock lecture may have been up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get there. If we finish at 5 or 6 o'clock, they're not going to get home till 9 o'clock, and they may be back at 9 o'clock the next morning. So our students are likely to be tired, some of them. So I don't know whether we should bear that into account when we're doing our teaching, but it is a good feature, I think, to know what your students are doing on a day-to-day basis. Why are they yawning in the front row? Why are they distracted at the back? Why are they seemingly falling asleep? It may be that they've had hardly any sleep and they've traveled for a long time to get to see you. So this makes it much more important for me to do something worthwhile for them in those learning and teaching sessions, to keep them awake, to keep them engaged, to keep them active. Incidentally, we have good data from Kingston University, which says, though, paradoxically, that the longer the commute, the less disadvantaged the students are. So we traditionally thought that commuting students, they're going to do less well than students who live in halls of residence, live locally to the campus. Closer investigation of the data, from data just like this, revealed, however, that on a long commute, students were able to organize some learning around their travel. So they may have one long train journey to come in, rather than have to catch a bus and then a tube and then another bus. For a journey less than an hour and a half, there were some disadvantages for commuting students. Over an hour and a half period, those disadvantages for traveling into university disappeared. And you can see on the box on the right, I can pull down different characteristics of my student group. I've targeted ethnicity here, but I can pull down a range of different student demographics and get data just like I'm showing here to identify my students' learning needs. Let's press the button again and see where we go from here. So when you hover over the data, it reveals specific data sets year by year and criteria by criteria, data set by data set. So every module leader has the equivalent of this database for their module. This is my course database. So I'm looking at all of my students in my courses year by year. So here's another data set, progression rates, first attempt and following reassessment. So our students do their exams, and if they fall short, they have a reassessment later on in the summer. These graphs plummet to the right-hand side. That's just an artifact in the system. So we don't have any data for 2022, 23, and the data set reveals that as 0. So please forget the plunging dark line on the right side and concentrate on the data in the middle coming up to 2021, 22. So that tells us that students often fail to progress at first attempt, but upon reassessment, virtually all of our students are successful. So that data set tells us that we may have a problem in progression at first attempt. And the British government is going to look at that in more detail and start fining institutions in Britain if they don't improve their progression rate at first attempt. So this is something that many universities in the country are looking at quite closely. We have to find some way of improving our teaching, making it more accessible to our diverse learners to enable them to be successful. So in the data set that I'm showing here now, we have refined the data to show the gaps. And the gaps are against a model standard student and enable us to show different demographic groups having some deficits in their learning in relation to that standard model student. So we can see here that we can easily identify specific cohorts of students who are at a disadvantage for whatever reason. And it's only through analyzing where the gaps are in different demographic student data are we able to put forward interventions to try and alleviate that situation. So this gap data is quite good. It's a rationalization of the data of student attainment in each of those criteria, demographic by demographic, and gives us a really easy, eagle-eye view of what's going on in my course at the different levels in the different years of the program, and which students seem to be struggling at what level and what kind of students are struggling. So that gap data is particularly interesting for me. So that was progression data. Now this is at level 6. So this is when students are graduating, coming out of the university with their degrees. Again, please forget the plunging nature of the curve on the right-hand side down to 2022, 23. We haven't got that data yet. And just concentrate on the data from 2017 to 2022. And you can see they're completed at level 6, the demographics. I have selected here as a criterion in the select demographics drop-down table on the right there, index of multiple deprivation. So the thing I was talking about at the beginning, my socially disadvantaged students, how are they doing year by year? And you can see the color coding there tells you from each bracket of that index of multiple deprivation, how the students are doing. And by this method, with all of this kind of data, a module leader can identify any deficits there are in the learning of specific students in the cohort, whilst as a course leader, I can see course level by level where the specific problems are. Here I've called up ethnicity, and now I can easily see how different ethnic subgroups within my cohorts are progressing year on year, and how they are graduating. So in Britain, we have this metric of a good degree, and we call a good degree any student who comes out with a first or 2-1. And what everybody tries to do in our system is try and get the students to attain a good degree, and all students. So there shouldn't be any difference between white students getting that good degree, which gives them good employment opportunities, with ethnic minority students. But regrettably, in Britain, historically, there's been a marked and profound gap between the achievement and the awarding of good degrees to white students compared to ethnic minority students. Now, if most of my students are ethnic minorities, then you can see I've got a major problem in my course. If 99% of my students come from ethnic minority groups and there is an awarding gap across the sector which shows that white students are outperforming ethnic minority students, then my students are at significant disadvantage to get good jobs at the end of their degrees. So here's another snapshot of a data set here, retention at good degrees. So retention is students progressing year on year, and good degrees is the exit qualification that the students are getting. So I can easily use the pull down menus to select the demographics. So I could put in a number of data sets here to see which specific students are being disadvantaged by the mode of teaching that they're being presented with. So very much in the Kingston context, we don't say that it's an achievement gap because that highlights a deficit in the student body. We say there's an awarding gap, and we say the deficit is within the institution and the manner of the teaching. Now, obviously, that has taken some time as a philosophical shift amongst some of my colleagues. It is never very palatable to be told that your teaching is not effective and you're not serving your students well. But many universities in Britain have embraced that kind of philosophy wholeheartedly. So it used to be called the achievement gap, but now philosophically it's called the awarding gap. And that is a tacit admission by universities that the way they deliver their material to their diverse student cohorts is not suitable for all of the students that are in the classroom. So the struggle at the minute is to find ways to address the awarding gap and overcome it so that you ensure that none of your students sitting in front of you are disadvantaged by the way that the institution is providing the learning and teaching material. So some of that is with the individual lecturer, but some of it is about the institution and how the institution treats the students. So not much more of the data sets because they're a bit boring, but you can see there's 1,000 ways you can analyze this data. And I spend weeks looking at this data when I compile this course evaluation plan, and I pull down all of the different demographics year by year and look at all the contextual information. There's lots of databases underpinning these, and that enables me to inform a coherent plan for the following year, having identified any deficits. But we also highlight good practice as well across the program. This is a particularly nice data set because it shows you the awarding gap very, very clearly. So I was particularly pleased in 2021 to see that my ethnic minority students, in fact, my black students, outperformed all of the other students. You can see that number there in the middle, 1.16. My black students outperformed all of the other students in the group. And that was held to be a good thing because the most obvious gap amongst the achievements of our students is amongst black students within our cohorts. So we have Chinese students, we have Asian students, we have Arabic students, but the biggest awarding gap has traditionally been with black students. And the interventions that we employed up to 2020 and 2021 seem to have been particularly effective in raising the achievement levels of our black students. Unfortunately, 2021-22 is a year when COVID came along, and for very many reasons, the awarding gap in my course got worse rather than better after we'd been doing lots of interventions and improving that awarding gap statistic for a long time. But there's the pull down menu. This time I'm looking at the index of multiple deprivation again, and that is telling its own story. I think I shall stop that there and go back to the talk. So hopefully that's given you an idea of the kind of data set that we can look at. And here's some static slides that I just prepared just in case the video didn't work very well. So now that we're armed with that kind of information, as a course director, I have all of this information at my fingertips, lots of databases. There's lots of databases underpinning that one overarching course evaluation plan. And that enables me to see where the pinch points are in terms of progression of my students year on year through the levels, and also the awarding of these so-called good degrees, those first-class degrees and 2-1 degrees. In the British context, a first-class degree is anything 70% and above in the whole program overall, and a 2-1 is anything 60% and above. So students are all aiming to get that good degree, a 60% and above or a 70% and above in their whole program. But as you can see from some of that data, students don't progress very easily first time round, although they're often very successful on reassessment. And we seem to have a problem with certain demographic groups achieving a good degree. So I'm just going to talk now about some interventions that we employed to tackle those specific problems. And if we have time, there are plenty of other things I can talk about as well. But these are just two specific interventions that we employed on my program to try and bridge that awarding gap and try to improve the year-on-year transition of the students through the levels. So could I ask whoever's just joined to mute there? Thank you very much. Good. So here's the first example, academic peer mentoring. So just some background information on that scheme. We pay second-year students who have been successful through the first year of their studies. We pay them to undertake peer mentoring of first-year students in timetabled sessions. Now, the two features which are pertinent there is the payment and the timetabling. Because our students are largely commuting students, they often don't hang around the campus unless they've got timetabled sessions. So they may travel for 2 hours to get to the institution, drop into a couple of lectures and a workshop maybe, and then go home. So if things are not timetabled for them, the commuting population drift in and out of the institution. So we don't really engender the feeling of a learning community. So we made a purposeful decision that those academic peer mentoring sessions should be timetabled formally within the students' timetables, and the second year students should be paid. So they get paid about £150 a week for any sessions they do in that week. And we get lots of students who are quite eager to do that because we have seen very obviously that second year students who do the mentoring benefit through lots of intangible really elements of that program. But in terms of social skills development, confidence building, even content knowledge, They are much improved, those second year students, and they're getting paid. But the first year students are also very grateful to be peer mentored by somebody who looks like them rather than somebody who looks like me, but also because they are confident in the knowledge that the student in front of them who's teaching them has successfully just progressed through the program that they're doing. So the experience is very relevant. So there's a combination there of the person and the process. The students have been through the process successfully, and they look like the students that they're mentoring. So this is funded by the Access and Participation Fund from the UK government, and that is specifically designed to facilitate the learning of various disadvantaged groups within the British society. Universities have traditionally used that money to tackle the ethnic minority awarding gap. But closer inspection of that Access and Participation Fund reveals lots of students are eligible for that money. So traveling communities, care leavers, army children. So there's lots of demographic cohorts in there, which universities are not really mindful of because they're so aware of the awarding gap for ethnic minorities. So that Access and Participation Fund money has often been targeted at ethnic minority students. One of the things I'm most proud about of my intervention is that even though we have devised these interventions to target ethnic minority students and the perceived awarding gap, it has also benefited all of the students within a cohort. And I'll show you some data about that now. And I think that's a very happy outcome from the use of that money from the Office for Students in the UK context. So the academic peer mentoring tackles the progression problem because we're looking at first years. And our first years come from a really wider range of backgrounds. So some of them bring in foreign qualifications from their country of origin. Some of them do non-standard school leaving examinations to get into university. In Kingston University, the standard 18-year-old student who's exited school from the A levels is not that obvious. We get lots of students coming in with different qualifications and from different backgrounds. So the first year is very much a job of bringing everybody up to the same level before we progress into the second and third years of the degree. So it is no wonder then there has been some problems in progression given the varied nature of the student body in the first year. And paying second year students to help them out has seen to be quite successful, as we'll see. So there's my course there, the pharmaceutical science course, top left hand. And for contrast, I'm showing on the bottom left there the politics, so a humanities discipline in my university, and another quantitative discipline here, maths. And the uplift of the students in terms of progression was 22.6% in my course, 20% in maths, but less in the politics course. So for whatever reason, this program, the academic peer mentoring, seems to benefit quantitative disciplines rather than the more qualitative disciplines. So I'm very happy about that. But what I'm most happy about is closer inspection of that data is that here's some various demographics I've pulled out from those data sets I showed you at the beginning. So we have lots of different student demographics there. First generation to higher education, income 25,000 or below, mature students, young, all of the varied nature of the students, the diverse students who enter into the program. And we can see that those students who weren't engaged in the academic peer mentoring program, they did all right. They progressed, not too bad. It's not excellent, and the government is going to look at that, as I said, and probably something like 73.3%. The government would not be happy with that kind of progression rate. But when we implemented the program, those students who engaged in it, virtually everybody, look at that, all of those hundreds down the right side. So that's telling me that those first year students who took tuition from a second year student in specific modules were very, very likely to pass that module. And in those instances where the number isn't 100, then we can obviously bore down in more granular detail to find out why that is. But I would say that was a very successful intervention because it has tackled some particularly difficult problems in the UK higher education context, for instance, the students who come in with a BTEC, then they are able to pass the system just the same as students who come in with an A-level, and our BTEC students have been a problem. Commuting students, as we said, had trouble progressing at first attempt, but in this scheme, commuting students were also successful. The interesting thing about this data is that the students who engaged had lower qualifications on average than the students who didn't engage. Despite being seemingly less qualified, those engaged students outstripped the disengaged students in terms of achievement. So just by participating in the program, regardless of the entry qualification of the student, we could tutor them to success. Students who came in with better qualifications, if they didn't engage with all of the teaching available, they didn't progress as well as the other students. And I think that's a very good outcome. So this money, like I said, is usually used for ethnic minority students, but has had the happy outcome of benefiting all students in the cohort. So we've raised the level for everybody by that specific intervention. Another problem identified is in the academic body, and as I said, I'm white, bald, middle-aged, middle-class man, so I may have difficulty relating to my students, and it is held in the UK context to be a good thing if the workforce is diversified within institutions too. Now that's going to be a problem because ethnic minorities are less visible in terms of going on to do PhDs and certainly going on to become lecturers and absolutely certainly in becoming professors. The number of black female professors in Britain can be counted on the fingers of one hand virtually. So there is lack of representation amongst the academic body. So we've got to improve the pipeline of research. So we have to get undergraduate students from specific demographics to be interested in research so that they go on to do PhDs, so that they become lecturers, so then they become professors, so that they can represent their communities within our diverse student bodies. So here's one scheme that we did to try and improve that pipeline right at the very beginning, and that was a summer internship scheme where students get paid to undertake research in the university laboratories. And there are very many advertised benefits of that kind of scheme. So it increases the likelihood of ethnic minority students pursuing postgraduate study. So that's the pipeline we're talking about. If they're going to do postgraduate study, they'll get a PhD. Then they'll be eligible to become an academic in university and join the professoriate. And in an American context, underrepresented students rated their learning gains higher in many areas than the comparison group when they got involved in an internship scheme. And there are other intangible benefits, improves laboratory and research skills, I'd say, enables those students to prepare for their final year research projects. So that pipeline goes summer internship at the end of the second year, final undergraduate research project, PhD, and so on. Students get to know you if they're in your lab in the summer and they find out that you're human. So we build these kind of partnerships, which are thought to be very good for student learning and student progression. Certainly builds student confidence, gives them time in a lab to make mistakes and to learn from them. Develop key skills because they have to apply for that job formally. So they have to write a cover letter and a CV, and there may even be a formal interview. And it's a competitive process because it involves students getting paid. It embraces research-informed teaching, so they're in the university laboratories and they may be ironing out practicals that may be used for undergraduate students or something like that, or doing research which may inform some PhD work later on. And it stretches the more able students. So one of the key things I've been saying throughout is that money which has been targeted traditionally at ethnic minority students can be used cleverly to lift the achievement of everybody. And in the UK context, and especially in my kind of university, we target lots of money and resources at struggling students. And there may be students within our cohorts who are just floating very easily through the system, effortlessly getting B pluses and A's, but we could stretch them so that they can reach their maximum achievements. So we shouldn't neglect anybody in our classrooms. But we found that ethnic minority students didn't apply or weren't very successful when they applied for the summer research internship scheme. And we wondered why that was. So we asked the students why they were reluctant, or why did they think they were unsuccessful in getting a summer research internship. So they said, of course, it took too much time to apply, and that is a very common feature of the frenetic nature of UK academic life. That's the same for academics, I guess. You could get the same data. But what was very interesting was confidence in grades. So ethnic minority students reported that they lacked confidence in their grades compared to their white peers. So white students were very confident in applying for the summer research internships. Black students and ethnic minority students were put off applying because they just didn't think they were good enough. So we did just small tinkering with that offer to students. We gave them more time to apply. We gave them more information. We tried to instill confidence in our ethnic minority students by explaining to them the benefits of the scheme in the long term and how they could apply. So we just made everything a bit more obvious, nothing very sophisticated. And when we employed that intervention within this overall intervention, we greatly improved the success rate of ethnic minority students in achieving one of those research internships. The white students also improved, but not very significantly, but making that whole process more transparent and easy for the students enabled everybody to improve their success rate. And we got more and more students applying for these roles year on year. So this scheme has been running for years now, maybe a dozen years, and it's increasing in popularity because students are really quite keen to get lab experience. And why is that important? Because doing the summer research internship seems to relate to getting good degrees. And here's that proportion of good degrees metric here. So that's an A or a B in the British system. Here's all students. So there is an uplift in the awarding of good degrees for students who did the internship, black, compared to those who applied for the internship but didn't get it. So these are the worried well. These are the keen students who didn't get a research internship. These are the ones who did. White students, if they did the internship, they were more likely than students who didn't do the internship to get a good degree, but it was not a significant increase. But the increase is important. We've brought everybody along. But most transformingly and most illuminatingly, I think, the minority ethnic students in the system had a very big increase in the proportion of good degrees awarded as a result of undertaking a summer research internship. So there might have been a logjam at the beginning of that pipeline of talent, and we seem to have unloosened it a bit by this scheme. So we have more ethnic minority students applying and succeeding to get a place on the summer research internship, and then that relates to the getting better degrees at the end. That makes it much more likely that they'll get a PhD and then enter into the academic arena. So this equality, diversity, and inclusivity conversation that takes place in universities has a small stumbling block in that somebody like me, confronted with that diverse student body, might be quite reluctant to politically engage with the nature of their disadvantage and the discrimination in society. So how do I start those conversations? Well, probably the best way is to get the students to tell you about it. So at the minute in Britain, there's lots of conversations about diversification and decolonization of the curriculum, making the curriculum less Eurocentric, making it more accessible for the kind of students we see in that figure. So I will very quickly, because I'm conscious that I might be running out of time, flick through, and I audited my students and said, did they think they were represented in the curriculum? Do they see faces like theirs in the curriculum? Did our teaching relate to them as individuals? And we can see there that students thought that there was a problem when we asked them. The problem is we never asked them. Do you mind that every scientist you come across in a textbook is a white scientist? That's something which is increasingly being asked in the UK context, given the nature of our student populations. So there's the data there which says the students have identified a problem and want to be represented in the curriculum. And here's one of the things that I've done to tackle that head on without putting my big heavy feet into this politically contested environment, because it's very easy for somebody from my background to make a mistake in this kind of environment. So I have to be careful, and this is why I've used students rather than myself. So here's the work of Hari Chand Jompita. He's a Sri Lankan student, Sri Lankan origin anyway, and he had the very bright idea of doing a case study of a Sri Lankan scientist who's contributed to the canon of literature, and he's represented them in the colors of the Sri Lankan flag. So here's the case-based study of this scientist, and here's Hari Chand Jompita's representation of that scientist from a photograph. So this is a kind of undergraduate project that one can do outside of the laboratory for students who want to express their creativity and maybe don't want to be a lab scientist with their degree. So this kind of infographic case-based study I'm using with undergraduate students and master's students so they can express themselves in these different kinds of ways, and very obviously finding ways to represent underrepresented scientists in our curriculum. So Hari Chand Jompita drew this diagram, which I thought was fantastic, and I'm generating that kind of data with a first year cohort, so they go off in a workshop to find people who represent themselves as individuals who are represented in the literature. So instead of the usual Eurocentric scientists, we ask them to find somebody who relates to them just by name, or if you're a white student, find somebody from your own city, from your own town, who shares your name, so nobody's excluded from that exercise. But many students try very animatedly and very engagedly to find a scientist from their own background. And our students come from such diverse places, that can be quite a task. I've got students from the Seychelles, students from Nepal, students from St. Lucia. So it's a real treasure hunt for them to look through the literature and try and find somebody who represents themselves in the literature. So that is a very engaging session. And we're building up a database there. So now students in the undergraduate project modules and in the master's modules can take that data and represent, as Hari Chand did, that as their project in an infographic case-based project. And here's some more work from Hari Chand. I think he did a fantastic job. And these are people who are very relevant in terms of science. So to you was the discoverer of artemisinin, anti-malarial drug. And Alice Augustus Bohr was the first pharmaceutical scientist from a black background in the United States, from the University of Hawaii. So students seeing these representations of scientists are really much more engaged in the curriculum than if I posted up traditional scientists. And that makes the first years very excited and gives final year project students and master students a real outlet for their creativity. And as you can see, Hari Chand Jompita has done a really good job here. Here's some student comments. I don't think I'll have time to linger here, but if you can read quickly, have a read. Students really appreciate that session, and it's a really excitable, engaged, active session, and students are competing with each other to try and find scientists who best represent themselves. The idea of mine, it wasn't particularly novel. It comes from The Woman in Science. This was a New York Times bestseller, Women in Science. But I just thought Hari Chand Jompita done such a fantastic job, because I'm looking at these animations and I don't think they're very good. But this was a New York Times bestseller, apparently. So my idea is to produce a resource like this for colleagues to use in their own classes, so that underrepresented scientists appear in the curriculum. So it would be, I don't know, ethnic minority scientists postcards or something is the resource I'm hoping to generate with master's fine art students eventually. But I'm conscious that I'm coming to the end. So they're increasingly teaching in the UK is looking at how to be culturally sensitive and inclusive. And Thomas and Quinlan in 2021 came up with these 4 pillars of culturally sensitive curricular scales. And I think what I did there, purely by accident really, has ticked most of those boxes. Diversity is represented. We've got positive portrayals of ethnic minorities. And that classroom interaction was very, very inclusive and engaging. Challenging the power, I'm not sure about. I'll have to think about that a bit more deeply, but just by happy accident, I think I've met at least some of those pillars of cultural sensitivity curricular scales. And the schemes that the students can be involved with at Kingston are varied and many. I haven't got time to explain all of them, but we do a ton of stuff for students and for staff. I've just highlighted a few which are particularly successful today. And Professor of Cambridge in this area really tackled these notions of the Eurocentric knowledge that we give to students in our classrooms. Why are those notions of absolute truth so fixed? So I've used my students to unfix those notions, hopefully, and maybe you will be emboldened to do so too in your own contexts. Yeah, as Julian said, we've done a few things which are good at Kingston University, and I think I should stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Nick, firstly, just thanks for a fantastic oversight, really, of using data and then some of the interventions you use. Alice, I hope, has possibly flagged some questions, so I'll hand straight over to her.
Thank you very much, Nick. I tried to do an applause and I put my hand up by mistake. Take my hand down. So yeah, thanks ever so much for that. Could I just ask people to add any questions into the chat? We've got a comment in the chat from Evelyn, who said that she very much liked the initiative you were talking about at the end there, doing representations of diverse scientists, and she's kindly shared the link in the chat as well for people who might be interested to have a look. Evelyn, did you have a question you wanted to ask, or were you just wanting to share?
I just wanted to share this, and I really like the initiative, and I also I really loved to read the comments of some students that they really liked this this exercise to do. I think it's a very good way to have attention for diversity, because sometimes we forget that we don't have all the attention for this topic within our courses. That's the only thing that I wanted to say.
Okay,
So
that's lovely.
One thing to be aware of when you're doing those ethnic minority scientists, though, is for copyright. So I've fallen afoul of the copyright thing. So I saw a talk at the British Pharmacological Society conference where somebody had done pharmacologists from underrepresented communities, and I asked the question, "Have you got copyright for all of those images you showed?" And they went, "Oh." So it is a problem. If you want to go further with this, and if you want to commercialize it, then you really need to track down the commercial copyright of the imagery. So interestingly, the one of Tuyuyu I showed there is a drawing of the drawing from the front of Time magazine. So somebody drew a representation of the scientist on Time magazine, and my student Harry Chan reproduced that in his own way. Now I've tried to get in contact with the person who drew the Time magazine thing, but got no reply. The one from Alice Augusta Ball is copyright free in the States because the United States has a cutoff period of, I think, 1912 or something. Anything before 1912 is copyright free in the American context. But I've reproduced it here. I have no idea if that corresponds to European copyright law or UK copyright law. So maybe I've taken a bit of chance by showing that data. So if colleagues are going to do that kind of thing with their own students, just to make sure you stay on the right side of the law, you need to make sure that you have the appropriate copyright permissions. It's something I'm having to deal with at the minute.
Thanks. That's very useful to bear in mind. Thank you, Nick. We've got another question in from Zafia asking, do you think that the initiatives you talked about would also work well if the students weren't getting paid? So I think that's in relation to the mentoring scheme you talked about.
Yeah, so they get paid for the mentoring scheme, and they also get paid for the student research internship. So the regrettable nature of higher education in the UK is now that students do quite significant amounts of paid work, and they have to do that because we charge high tuition fees relatively in the UK. So we no longer have the kind of traditional student who moves city to go to university and just is a student. Many of my students, they stay at home, they're commuting students, and the university is just one part of their lives. Other parts of their lives involve paid work to pay their way through university. So I fear that the take-up from these kind of interventions will be much less if they weren't paid. So there's a reason that we pay the students, is to get their engagement, because they can't afford not to work sometimes. So we have this concept of the sticky campus. And we want this campus to be sticky. So we offer lots of those initiatives. I gave a brief list of some of the things that students can do at the end. And we do that because we want to stop students being those commuting students who travel all the way across London for hours on various modes of transport, dip into a lecture, and then just beaver off back home again as soon as possible. Because that doesn't give us a vibrant learning community. That's just an educational drop-in centre. We don't want to be an educational drop-in centre. We want to be a university in the classical context. We want students to inhabit the space. So I always say to my students, treat it as a 9-to-5 job. If you don't have lectures or sessions, find something else to do. There's many things you can do to interact with the university. Do them. You can be a paid employee of the university. So we have meeters and greeters for various functions, and they wear variously brightly coloured T-shirts saying, I'm a Kingston ambassador, I can help. And they get paid for that. So there's lots of paid opportunities for our students. Because in the British context, we're very aware that students are under financial constraints. Irregardless of the current difficulties, even traditionally, our students have had to work quite significant numbers of hours to pay their way through university. So I think, yes, it is essential for us to have to pay those students. That was a very long answer to a quite short question. I'm apologizing.
I mean, a follow-up question is, have you looked at the learning benefits to the mentors themselves as well as to the mentees?
So not formally, but anecdotally, yes, they really blossom. They're much more engaged in the institution, so they acquire this institutional habitus. They feel like they're members of the university then, and that's quite a barrier for many of our students because they're from immigrant populations. English isn't their first language. They may be the first generation to university. So university is an alien place. But once they've been employed by the university to teach students, then they're in it. They really inhabit that space and they feel like members of the community. And that's our biggest hurdle, I think, is getting our non-traditional students from these very diverse backgrounds to feel like they belong. And we've tried various interventions to make our students feel like they belong.
That's great. Is there time for one more question, Julian?
Is there a final question, and then we should close, I think.
There's no other questions in the chat, but I did have one last one, Nick, relating to the metric that you were using at the beginning. You were talking about using the index of multiple deprivation as the metric that you've got the data sets for there. Have you got any comment on whether that is a good metric? Is there anything that's maybe missing?
So yeah, my biggest complaint about the data set is that you could see in terms of ethnicity, and that it plays into the index of multiple deprivation data set as well, is that we've only got 3 or 4 categories. So what do you do with a student who is Iranian or Syrian or Afghani or Nepalese? They don't fit into any of those categories, and they're very, very different students. So I've had to, for a project, go through data by hand, student by student, and only by doing that did I find out that in one particular context, our Iranian students were being disadvantaged. So I would never have uncovered that with the data sets that we have. They're very, very granular, much more granular than many institutions, but still not granular enough. So that index of multiple deprivation is a bit nebulous, but it does give you a snapshot of where your students are coming from and gives you a hint at some of the difficult circumstances they may have at home. But you're right. We should really have something which hones in on very small numbers of students to try and identify hurdles to progression and hurdles to achievement for all of our students as individuals.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Nick, I think we should wrap there by saying a fantastic talk right through from analytics to interventions, and a big thanks to all those who have come to the webinar. And Nick, it's a good start to our webinar series. I'd encourage those listening to look out for the next webinar, which will be in a month to 6 weeks' time. And again, if I can just do a sales pitch for the event in Walsall from the 26th to the 28th of April, if you can make it to that, that would be fantastic. But Nick, thanks once again, and I hope we can all catch up again soon. So thanks ever so much, and thanks to Alice.
Thank you, Alice. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, colleagues.
Thanks
for your
Take
time.
care, everybody.
Bye.